Next up, we have Patricia Vieira. Now, she's an associate professor of Spanish. She's got a great title. Associate professor of Spanish and Portuguese, comparative literature and film and media studies at Georgetown University, as well as an associate research professor at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. Now, Patricia, I would assume you speak Portuguese?
Yeah.
That means you can say Lima Coelho much better than I can, because my last name means rabbit in Portuguese, which is slightly ironic at a plants talk, thinking. Patricia is motivated by a desire to bring together scientists and humanities. She's a true interdisciplinarian and co-edited a book called The Language of Plants, Science, Philosophy, and Literature. The researcher is on plants, but by nature, she feels it's cross-disciplinary. One of her goals is to, and there's no pun intended here, I'm sure, sow the seeds of collaboration. Well done. The other motivation she's got, which I think is fascinating, is around the whole notion of plant ethics. Some of you might be sitting at a table with a question that targets into plant ethics. Should our approach to plants be legally codified in plant rights? Which is a really challenging question I've never thought of. But some of my colleagues in Canadian music, I'm in an a cappella group called the Heebie-Jeebies. If you've ever heard of us, my apologies. Yes. But we've got some brothers in arms in the musical a cappella comedy genre called the Arrogant Worms. Has anybody ever heard of the Arrogant Worms? This is from an Arrogant Worms song, and I'm going to read to it because I think it speaks to the heart. JC's nodding, he knows. The lyric goes as this. Listen up, brothers and sisters, come hear my desperate tale. I speak for our friends of nature, trapped in the dirt like a jail. Vegetables live in oppression, served on our tables each night. This killing of veggies is madness. I say we take up the fight. Salads are only for murderers. Coleslaw, a fascist regime. Don't think that they don't have feelings just because a radish can't scream. I'm sure she's going to put us straight on this. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia Vieira.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be lazy and just sit down and speak from here. I hope everyone can hear me. I would like to thank Jim, of course, for the invitation, and I'm really thrilled to be back in Canada after a number of years of just sticking to the United States. And if you have any questions, I mean, this is very informal, so feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask anything you would like. So what I would like to talk to you about today is what we can learn from plants. I'm going to frame these reflections by starting to tell you a bit about how I came to this idea that we should be learning from plants. Not just learning about plants, but from plants. As we've heard already, plants are a fundamental form of life, and they provide sustenance and enable the existence of all animals, including Homo sapiens. And humans have often pondered their place among all the life forms that inhabit the earth, but plants are not always at the forefront of our concerns. Science traditionally privileged the study of animals because it tries to pinpoint what distinguishes humans from our closest evolutionary relatives. As we saw with JC's talk, Darwinian and post-Darwinian scientific views emphasize the continuities that bind all life together, and Darwin was an avid researcher of plants. But still, the study of animals remains the central scientific concern. A biologist I work with called Monica Gagliano found out in a study of the scientific literature of the last 5 years that on average, 1 paper is published on plants for every 2 papers published on animals. So this was just a very broad research that she did. And so this shows us that we really tend to focus more on animals. Similar to science, philosophy has historically focused on the study of human beings. It foregrounded what distinguishes us from other animals, and the human was understood, as Aristotle famously wrote, as a political animal. So we were just a specific kind of animal, an animal that is gifted with logos or reason, discourse, and so on. And so the living beings that were similar to humanity were perceived as being inherently superior to the ones that were a bit further away from humans, right? And this gradation was codified in the so-called scala naturae, in Latin for the ladder of nature. And it was also known in the Renaissance as the great chain of being. So this meant that all life was viewed, and non-life was viewed hierarchically. At the bottom, we had inanimate beings, then we had the plants right after, then animals, then humans, and then after that, at the very top, at the height of the pyramid, we had God. That was the guarantor of the whole system. So plants were very far down below this pyramid of life. So this notion that plants are imperfect and ontologically lacking those features that render animals superior and better, and some of these features are, of course, movement, intentionality, the ability to communicate. All of these ideas that plants are inferior because they don't have these characteristics were to remain a philosophical belief and tenet very much after the Renaissance. If some plants were perceived as a source of pleasure, especially of aesthetic pleasure, namely the flowers, right? Most plants were relegated to the margins of philosophy, and they were not deemed to be worthy of attention by philosophers. The favoring of animals, and especially of mammals over plants, still continues in contemporary thinking. And works that dissect the relationship between humans and animals are very common. Of course, most of you probably know, and I know that there was a seminar here on animals. You probably heard and have read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation from the 1970s, and more recent books like Cynthia Willett's Interspecies Ethics that focuses mostly on primates. So there are all of these books about our relationship to animals, but philosophical approaches to plants are much less common, and I'll talk about a couple of them in a minute. And then the situation, our privileging of animals, is then reflected in ethical and also in political attitudes. Animal protection movements have existed in the West at least since the 19th century, and some form of animal rights is now part of the legal system of most Western countries. But many people would still regard the notion of plant rights as something strange, right? This is something we can discuss a bit later. Still, these prevalent scientific and philosophical views on plants that have resulted in what we might call a zoocentric mode of thinking have slowly began to be changed. Recent scientific studies, such as the ones we have just heard about, have shown that plants have a behavior, that they're active and communicative organisms. And these research fields have really shown that plants are a lot more like animals than we have previously thought, and we've just heard about that. In philosophy, as in science, not all regard plants as passive objects ready for human appropriation. An example is a recent book called Plants as Persons, a Philosophical Botany by Matthew Hall, who goes back to Hindu, Buddhist, and animist traditions in an effort to extend the category of personhood to plants, right? Following these religious lines. The work of Michael Marder, who happens to be my husband, so there's a bit of publicity here, also reveals how the deconstruction of what we think about plants is necessary if we want to really reimagine a new concept of nature that is not just so focused on animals and on humans, but also on the whole of the environment. So, to sum up, until now, investigations on plant behavior in the sciences and new philosophical approaches to plants, together with what we call in the humanities eco-criticism, which is the study of literature and of the arts in relation to the environment. So all of these new fields have prompted a reconceptualization of our relation to plants. Science has opened the door to a cognitive approach to plants, with studies showing that plants have behavior, memory, make decisions, and learn from experience, and so on. And research on the philosophical import of plants, in turn, have revealed our indebtedness not only in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of ontology and of epistemology to the way plants live. So it's in this context, in the context of these, we might call it this turn to plants, that I proposed the idea of phytognosis. That is to say, the knowledge about and from plants. So phytognosis, as I was saying, refers to two separate but related forms of knowledge. On the one hand, it tries to expand our knowledge of plants in a variety of fields, and it requires us to struggle against this zoocentric bias that I was talking about in the beginning, and that is still prevalent in many fields, from the sciences to the humanities. There is even a term called plant blindness, meaning that often we don't really notice or see plants because we, as mammals, tend to look for things that are moving rapidly, just for questions of survival, right? For us, it's important that if something is moving toward us, we might want to just escape and flee and so on. And so we tend to see plants really more as a background to our lives, exactly because they don't pose usually an immediate threat, right? And so there is this idea that humans and many mammals suffer from a sort of plant blindness, and that is why we privilege the study of animals as opposed to plants. And so this phytognosis would be a move away from this plant blindness and to try to learn more about plants. Critical plant studies in the fields of the humanities and the social sciences has emerged within this framework of a reevaluation of plants, of the representation of plants, and of human-plant interactions, much as animal studies developed in the 1990s in response to the debates about animal ethics during the previous 2 decades, the 1970s and the 1980s. Leaving aside the sciences that I am really not really qualified to discuss at all, and we've just heard a brilliant talk about it, I would like to point out some of the many questions we should try to address in the humanities when talking about our knowledge about plants. In philosophy, for instance, what is the specific ontology of plants, the plant mode of being in the world? And JC was talking a bit about this from his perspective. So what is the plant's mode of existence? And one might even question the idea, just following up on what JC talked, of whether we can think of plants as individuals, because you were saying that we need to research them as individuals. But for instance, I was thinking in terms of, if you think about grass, where would an individual be? I mean, plants raise these questions about individuality because, of course, for animals, and especially for mammals, it's very easy to think about individuals. But if we think about plants, and especially some kinds of plants, it's very difficult to decide where an individual ends and where the next individual begins. I mean, can we even think about individuality in these terms if we talk about plants? Another philosophical question would be, as Ken pointed out, the ethical consequences of this recent turn to plants. If plants are sensitive beings, should we continue eating them? I mean, there was this whole movement about vegetarianism and veganism in response to animal rights debates in the 1980s and 90s, and now the next frontier would be the plants. Should we be eating them, and then what should we eat if we can't eat animals and plants? There's not much left, right? And again, should the sociopolitical status of plants change in light of new discoveries in plant science? So if plants have all these abilities and behaviors which we used to attribute only to animals, should they be endowed with rights? Is it acceptable to instrumentalize plants for economic gain, for instance, if they have, for instance, memory, behavior, sensitivity, and so on? Should we be allowed to cut down a pine to use it as a Christmas tree? Or to pluck a flower and put it in a vase? Or to create a garden? I mean, all of these are questions that would come out of this turn to plants. In literature and in film studies and in art studies in general, another set of issues is raised when we approach plants from this new point of view. How can plants and how have they been represented in literature and in cinema? And how do these representations reflect our biases towards the plant world? Are plants a mere background for human action, as for instance, in portrayals of the landscape, or can they play an active role in the development of a plot? And I'm thinking, for instance, of a film such as The Happening. I don't know if some of you watched this film. It's quite interesting because people start committing suicide out of nothing, and then it turns out that it was a volatile, a chemical released by plants that was inducing people to commit suicide because plants were feeling threatened by humankind, and so they were defending themselves by releasing this volatile. Right? So it really raises questions about the agency of plants and the way that they can behave in the world in ways that we usually think are ways of animal behavior. But phytognosis entails more than transforming this anthropocentric and zoocentric form of looking at plants so as to learn from the plant world. Phytognosis is both our knowledge of plants and the knowledge of the plants themselves, and that's where I'd like to go now. This approach to plant life is one that takes into considerations what the plants know and that tries to learn not only about plants, but also from plants. And just to end, and I'm not sure how I am with time. Yeah, I have some time. Yeah, so I'd like to end with a few points or a few ideas of how we can learn from the mode of being and the mode of existence of plants. Point one, one significant difference that separates plants from animals, including from us humans, is that plants are able to create their own source of nourishment, right? That enables, in fact, the whole life on Earth. Plants are self-sufficient, and we use the energy harnessed by plants for our own nourishment. Of course, we humans cannot aspire to imitate photosynthesis, but plants, I think, teach us a lesson in sustainability. Instead of preying on other beings, both the ones that live now and the ones that are long dead, in the case of fossil fuels, right, which are basically the bodies of dead plants, we should try to imitate plants and, as far as possible, produce our own energy in the same way as plants use solar energy to produce their own sources of nourishment. Furthermore, the byproduct of the vegetal production of energy is not a polluting substance, but it's oxygen, which is again central for life on Earth. So again, phytognosis would imply learning to exist on Earth while enabling the flourishing of other beings that share the planet with us, just using plants really as an example of how to do this. A second point, the second major point I think we could learn from plants, goes back to another central difference between plants and animals, and that is that plants have a capacity to regenerate that far surpasses that of other living beings. So a plant, I mean, scientists probably know this better than me, but I have read in scientific literature that a plant can lose up to 90% of its body and still regenerate without being killed. So a tree can be pruned and have most of its branches cut down and still flourish the next spring. I mean, this would be unthinkable for an animal, and especially for a mammal, right? Imagine we would have 90% of our body cut off and still the next spring regenerate and regrow and so on. So this is something that is quite amazing about plants. And actually this capacity, this ability of plants to regenerate has often been used not as a source of admiration by us, but we use it to denigrate plants. We think, oh, we can cut them down as much as we want, they'll just grow again. So it doesn't really matter if we destroy a plant or a forest because it has the ability to regenerate. And often, I think we expand this idea not only to plants, but to the whole of nature. So we can do whatever to nature because it will have the ability to regenerate, like plants, right? So I think it makes us feel better with ourselves that we're destroying nature by thinking that it can regenerate pretty much in the same way as plants do, right? And plants can do this because they have a modular structure that basically, as far as I understand it, reproduces similar elements again and again. Already Goethe, German writer from the 18th century, wrote in his Metamorphosis of Plants, this was scientifically quite wrong, but that was his idea, that plants are just a modification of the leaf. So any part of a plant is just a modification of a leaf of a plant. So basically his idea, again, goes back to this theory of the modules, that plants are made of modules that just reproduce again and again. So even if you cut apart, another module can just take over and just reproduce itself. Right? So plants, again, they do not have a brain, which is one of the reasons why, as far as I understand it, many scientists are opposed to using words such as plant intelligence or plant behavior, because plants don't have a central nervous system, obviously, because they don't have a brain. And therefore, to talk about intelligence, then the question comes, but where is that intelligence located, right? Because we tend to think from an animal point of view that there have to be specific organs to do specific things in a body, right? So if you want to have intelligence, you have to have the intelligence organ, which is the brain. Or if you want to have breathing, you have to have the breathing organ, which is the lungs, and so on. And plants don't do that so much. Many of these functions are spread throughout their whole bodies, right? So again, it goes to this idea that plants, they don't focus in as much their activities and their abilities into specific parts. What plants can do is spread out throughout their whole bodies, right? And so humans have traditionally seen, as I said, this idea that this view of plants as being able to regenerate and to have their activities and their ways of existing spread out throughout their bodies as an excuse to actually mistreat plants very often, right? But we could also see this as a positive example, and some philosophers have done this. An example are two French philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who used specifically the idea of the rhizome in plants to offer us a blueprint for a non-hierarchical, socio-political, and economic structure that would have no head, but rather a multiplicity of communicating parts like modules, right? So this would be following the plant model, right? This has interesting consequences. So what if, instead of thinking of politics and of the state as an animal, and traditionally we think of politics going back to the Renaissance as a leviathan, as a monster that has a head and then a body, right? So this is our traditional model for thinking about the state. What if we were to think about the state from a plant point of view, where there is no head, where you just have different branches spreading out? What would be the consequences of this horizontal view of society for our institutional organizations, for instance? So this is another way of learning from plants, from a political point of view. So what would our politics look like if, instead of taking animals as models, we would take plants as models for our political organization, right? So this is something we could learn from plants. A third thing we might learn from plants goes back to another large difference separating plants and animals, and that is that, apart from some exceptions, plants are sessile beings, so they stay rooted to a spot. We know that their seeds can travel. We know that some plants, especially there are some palm trees I hear that move their roots, and so they move in time, but of course they don't move as fast as animals do and as mammals do, right? And so to us, from the everyday point of view, it would seem that plants are immobile, that they stay on the spot. Again, this characteristic of plants has historically been regarded as a sign of a deficiency of plants being inferior to animals because they cannot really choose where they grow. If the seed falls in a specific spot, it's not like the seed can decide to move to a different spot and just go there. So it has to stay in that spot, right? And so this has been seen as a deficiency of plants when compared to animals. But we could also learn from this rootedness of plants. If you're tied to a place, you need to cherish and nurture that place because it can become unsuitable to support life if you don't do this, right? Instead of depleting and rendering barren a given region and then moving on to exploit the next one, as some animals, including humans, very often do, plants nourish their environment, and the bodies of dead vegetal matter provides the soil with nutrients needed for the growth of future plants. Right? A phytognostic approach to plant life would learn from this attachment to a specific place. At our time of environmental destruction, when humans are even already looking for other planets as possible replacements for Earth, so once we completely destroy the Earth, we can go like Elon Musk is trying to do, create a colony in Mars or whatever, because we already know that the Earth is not going to last long. So this is a typically animal behavior, right? We just exploit the place where we are and use up all the resources and dirty it and so on, because we know that we can move to Mars and then somewhere else in the future and so on. And then at some point we'll also destroy Mars and then we'll move to another planet that would be still pristine and destroy that one and so on ad infinitum, right? So as opposed to this view, and I'm thinking again about another film. I don't know if you've watched Interstellar. It's exactly about this. So the Earth is becoming unlivable, and so people need to go on and move to a different planet. And what is, I think, worrisome about that film is that this is presented as a good thing. So these people are heroes because they're moving us to another planet after we've destroyed the one that we had, right? And so plants, on the other hand, teach us to care for and preserve the environment that allows for our existence. And they are a constant reminder of how reckless it is to dirty and to devastate our own home, right? So they remind us of this on a daily basis. And then a final example of phytognosis, of what we can learn from plants, takes as a point of departure some of these recent scientific studies that highlight the plant's forms of communication, decision-making, language, and even vision through their sensitivity to sun rays. The recognition that much of what we thought were human, or at least animal features, are not just features of animals, but are shared by all living beings, show us that Homo sapiens is not the pinnacle of creation, but really just one species among many others that are also very remarkable, right? Our lives are neither more complex nor superior to those of other animals or of plants, many of which have existed on Earth much before we came along, and I unfortunately suspect they'll continue to exist long after we are no longer here, especially plants, of course. So plants teach us that the human mode of existence should not be seen as the measure of all life, and that the idea that all other living beings exist exclusively for our use, they show us that this idea is just a fantasy that we created in our heads. So perhaps most important than anything else, plants teach us humility and teach us that we are really not as special as we thought that we were. So just to finish, phytognosis is a pressing task, I think, in the context of the current environmental crisis. Turning to plants, learning about and from them, paves the way for a less instrumental approach, not only to the environment, to the way we behave towards plants and animals, but I think even to social relations, to our interactions with our fellow human beings, which I think would gain from our learning a bit more from the way plants behave in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Wasn't that fascinating? Holy smokes, where to start? So basically, we have a Hobson's choice. We can either destroy the planet and move along or eat a salad at lunch. So good luck on your choice. This whole notion, Patricia, of the political attitudes, you said something that I thought was fascinating around the activism. We saw, as you said, activism growing in the 80s and 90s that have led to literally vegan lunch today. Could you see us getting closer to real activism around the whole notion of plant rights?
I'm often asked about this issue of food. It's something that people get very concerned about because they ask, we already can't eat animals. Now if we can't eat plants, what is it going to be? I mean, how are we going to survive? We cannot go and then just eat rocks. But I think it's even in the case of animals, and especially, of course, in the case of plants, it seems to me that it's much more the way we eat than what we eat. So our behavior toward what we eat, as opposed to just the actual things that we eat, right? Often we don't think about we eat. We think about food as fuel, right? Again, we use this paradigm of energy to reflect about everything, and we just think of food as gas that we're putting in the car, except that we're putting it into ourselves, right? So I think what we need is a reflexive attitude towards what we eat, right? Thinking about how our food is produced. You were talking even about how people, not so long ago, 1-2 generations ago, they had a completely different relationship towards their food because they grew their food, they had a daily contact with animals and plants, and so the idea of eating something that came from the other side of the world was completely foreign to them. Right? And so I think it's much more about how we think about food and how we produce our food than about what exactly we eat. And of course, now in terms of animals, there's this whole movement of the meat without animals, that the meat is produced in a lab, which might be, I guess, a way out of animal suffering. But with plants, I'm not sure how we could produce just parts of plants that are edible in the lab. Probably it's feasible as well. JC would probably be able to tell us a bit more about that.
Absolutely fascinating. It occurs to me also that perhaps our government might be well served if it was run by a potted plant. So there's that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Patricia Vieira.